Ms. Wylde is an internationally known expert in housing, economic development, and urban policy. She received honorary degrees from Fordham University and St. Francis College and serves on several boards and advisory groups, including the New York City Economic Development Corporation, the New York City and Company, the Fund for Public Schools, the U.S. Trust Advisory Committee, the Manhattan Institute, the NYU Lutheran Medical Center, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, the Governor's New York City Regional Economic Development Council, and the Governor's Business Regulation Council. She has authored numerous articles and policy papers and has been recognized for her leadership by dozens of educational, professional, and nonprofit institutions. Ms. Wylde is a native of Madison, Wisconsin, a graduate of St. Olaf College, and resides in Brooklyn, New York. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Wylde to our council meeting.
Thank you. I noticed as you were reading my overly long resume that you didn't include a transportation organization. So I'm unabashedly here as not an expert on transportation, but rather on the business community's perspective on the transportation infrastructure issues. And that's, I hope, what I can bring a little bit about today, particularly in the context of the immediate crisis. And it's interesting to me that NYMTC represents this interface between state and local government and transportation agencies and the federal government, which we really don't have a counterpart on the execution side of projects. And one of the things that we're looking for in the business community is to see the kind of collaboration and coordination around our infrastructure, transportation infrastructure projects that you've achieved on the planning side, to bring that into the execution side and to bring the interests of advocates and planners like yourselves together. And if you look at, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Albany this year. This voice, this collective voice focused on execution, is not being heard. And I think that's the opportunity that we have most immediately in the next 30 days, but through a phased commitment the governor has made through over the next 2 years to really get something done in this region that is unique and new. The great thing about New York is we have very strong institutions, we have very strong industry interests, we have very strong labor interests. Unfortunately, the strength of those interests tends to result in intransigence to change. And we right now, fortunately, have leadership from Governor Cuomo and from many of the county leaders that I've been following that want to see change happen, that recognize that technology and changes in funding formulas, our assumptions about what comes from the federal government, our assumptions about what we have to do ourselves have changed dramatically in the past couple of years, and that has to be reflected in our institutions, in our laws, in our incentives, and how we approach the transportation infrastructure issue. That's leadership is needed to make that happen. It requires cooperation between Albany and the localities. And to me, I'm delighted you're all here because I feel when I go to Albany that that is missing, that when we sit down and talk, we actually find common interest across interests that we don't see it being achieved in Washington. We find here we have to do something about that. So I'm going to very quickly talk a little bit about, from the business community standpoint, transportation infrastructure starts with that our economy has grown 22% since 2001. Our transportation infrastructure has not kept up in that growth. Part of that growth is a diversification of where jobs and populations are growing, where we don't have adequate transportation services. So it's not simply maintaining and improving what we have, but expanding our system. Last summer, we did a survey of foreign international business CEOs, 50 of them, who, it was an individual survey, and asking them what would it take to grow their presence in New York. and expand their job creation here. They all said their biggest concern about expanding in New York was the unreliability and the deterioration of our public transportation system. Obviously, one of the things they care a lot about is thinking about many companies. Most major companies in New York have employees and business operations on both sides of the Hudson River. So the Gateway Project and everything that represents is a big issue. But it's true generally that the infrastructure, I mean, Joe Loda says what keeps him up at night is not the tunnels under the Hudson, but the tunnels under the East River. So we've got huge issues. The business community is acutely aware of them and very concerned about the future. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that you've got, while we haven't had much success in pushing forward with a major infrastructure program in Washington, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is actually recommending an increase in the gas tax in order to fund an infrastructure program. And that is an indication, you don't get the Chamber of Commerce recommending tax increases often, that is an indication of how important this area is to the business community, mobility generally, whether it's the airports or the commuter rail, or the subways, it all matters. In terms of the current situation where we find ourselves, about a decade ago, Mayor Bloomberg made a full-court press for congestion pricing, which some of you may remember. He was really reflecting the business community's point of view. Let me see if I can. Did I do the change in slides? No. Not working. Oh, wait. I think I'm going backwards. Thing upside down. So from a business community standpoint, traffic congestion is a huge issue. When we did this study 10 years ago for Mayor Bloomberg's report, we found 13 billion, HDR actually did the study, we found $13 billion in cost of excess destructive traffic congestion in the region. This is not just Manhattan, this is the whole region. In fact, if you do the analysis, the biggest factor of delay in terms of lost hours, lost productivity are actually people going to jobs in Queens, which we all understand some of the reasons contributing to that. So $20 billion a year is what we see as the cost of congestion, most of that coming through time lost through people commuting to work or doing work-related travel. So this is a huge issue for us. Congestion pricing to the business community is an important way to address those losses. The Fix New York Commission and so traffic congestion, I start with that, is an opportunity, yes, to reduce costs, improve efficiencies, and at the same time to raise about $1.1 billion. Right now, it looks like the traffic congestion plan in Albany is, to put it optimistically, a phased-in approach over a few years. But that's better than not having it there at all, and the governor has included a process to get there. And I think this is an area that's very important because it results in, it moves us in the right direction. But traffic congestion, while it's the most, it's gotten the most attention, is only part of the overall set of issues. Obviously, the MTA has huge unmet funding needs, and there are regional transportation funding needs beyond the MTA, but I'm going to focus on that. The governor put forward a subway action plan for $850 million short-term plan split between the city and the state. The city said we're not going there, although now the city council speaker last week suggested that he might go there, or the council might recommend that. But that's what we shouldn't be shutting down on those kinds of issues, because what we really need is the full financing package, and we need to think of new ways to fund it. The governor set up this Fix NYC commission, which I am on, that didn't get mentioned, and that commission came out with a plan that recognizes, number one, I've got a chart on this thing, if you can see it, which shows the taxes currently dedicated to the MTA, which are about $5 billion a year, which is substantial. Again, from a business perspective, we're not really ready to say we need more taxes to fund the MTA until we see that we've got a far better system for, again, execution, a project execution. So the Fix New York Commission is responding to the issue of are more taxes the answer, and saying, well, let's look at congestion pricing, and then let's also look at the fact that New York just is about to lose, starting this year, $14.3 billion a year because of the loss of state and local deductibility on federal income taxes. Taxpayers here, this is not the time to be going back to taxpayers saying you're going to further raise their taxes. So in terms from a realistic standpoint, we do not think tax increases are on the table, and at the same time, whether you talk about fares or about debt, essentially we're pretty full up in terms of what we can support out of the MTA operating budget for debt, and what is reasonable in terms of fares and tolls. So we have to find some new solutions. From a business standpoint, we think that the governor has made a terrific move in creating real depth in leadership, top leadership at the MTA and for that matter, the Port Authority. And that this is an opportunity that we should all be taking advantage of. And what we're looking at is, yes, push forward on congestion pricing, on the other elements of enforcement and the other elements of the Fix New York City report. If you haven't read it, you should. That's going to be that is in the governor's budget amendment, and those will be on the table. But there are a couple other items that are equally important if we're going to make up the resource gap. From our perspective, well, I must be doing it wrong again. No. I hate audiovisual. Okay, so from our perspective, one of the things we haven't talked about for about a decade are P3s, public-private partnerships. If an infrastructure bill comes out of Washington and the framework, certainly out of the administration, it's going to include requirements for private sector participation in financing the solutions to local infrastructure needs. New York is way behind other world cities and way behind much of the rest of the country in having a mechanism. And this is where I talked about what you've got at NYMTC in terms of a place where local land use issues and zoning issues, together with state and federal financing issues, can be resolved in a planning context on an execution. Doing individual transactions, negotiating these deals is not happening. A perfect example was in the newspapers yesterday. For those whom you saw, there was a negotiation going on, and I haven't talked to anybody on the private sector side about this, but from what I read in the paper, there's a negotiation going on by which J.P. Morgan Chase is going to acquire 700,000 square feet of air rights, buildable space, from the Grand Central Station air rights. Now, here we have a $11 billion investment going into East Side Access underneath Grand Central. The MTA isn't even at the table. The value of these air rights was achieved through a city Midtown Rezoning Act, which was negotiated between the Bloomberg and de Blasio administrations, the real estate board, the private sector, to figure out how to maximize the value of this transit, the most important transit hub in the region, becoming more important with East Side Access hopefully coming online. The transit world is not at the table in terms of negotiating what they want to receive, how the value comes out of that project. So what the governor is trying to do this year is to am I going the right direction? No. Is to introduce the concept of public-private partnerships and value capture transactions in his budget amendment. I will say humbly that the language is not crafted to be particularly understandable and is a little provocative, but the concept, and the governor has said, the concept is to engage with local governments. The concept is really important. And so while hopefully in the next 30 days the language gets negotiated, I hope that you as transit and community advocates will be thinking about this notion that we cannot allow these huge deals from the benefits of transit improvements not to capture some of the financing. And this isn't just tax increment financing. Yes, Mayor Bloomberg paid for the number 7 line through tax increment financing, taking a piece of the real estate taxes. This is not just about real estate taxes. This is the whole concept of how you structure a deal, and that other cities have very successfully done, and we have not in this region done, where you figure out when you're doing the Midtown rezoning, how do we take the value that's being created here and make sure that we're reinvesting a good portion of that into transit improvements. That forum does not exist where those negotiations can take place with public and public agencies, private sector, the city, the state, the county, at the same table, figuring out how do we maximize this value and how do we maximize what mass transit gets out of it. That is what we're missing, and that's what we hope that this year the legislature will put on the table, both to prepare us for the federal legislation, any kind of infrastructure financing that might come down from the federal level that will require us to have this kind of tool in place, and also to find new sources of financing for transportation. I think one problem is that the people who are the really strong transit advocates, whether it's the professionals in the industry or it's the riders or it's the employers, are not necessarily expert on these kind of real estate development, financial negotiation issues. This isn't their centerpiece cup of tea, whereas for those who would like things to stay as they are because it's working for them, they think, and they're hoping against hope that somebody else will pay for it, it's time to recognize nobody else is going to pay for it. And the value capture mechanism that the governor is putting forth in concept, and that we all have to work hard to figure out, what does that look like? Is it some expansion of the Capital Projects Review Board at the MTA? Is it a new entity? What is that? We have to work together on figuring that out, and hopefully we can do that in the next 30 days. But it will take advocacy from this community, from all of you, to make that happen, because if we don't have that advocacy, the governor and the MTA leadership are going to be out there on their own trying to argue this, and they've just got too many irons in the fire to be able to do that effectively without our support. Not just on congestion pricing, which is important, not just on the for-hire vehicle charges and the other kind of activities, the other kind of improvements we want to see, but on these more difficult concepts of how we change the way we do business when we're planning the future of development related to transportation and the impact that has on transportation. So that's really the message that I wanted to bring today, is to encourage all of your participation. I think I may have one more slide. In that effort, wrong way. Oh, I have one more slide as an illustration, which is on the other piece that we're arguing for, is the city's design build. Is caring about not just what gets done, which I know is your focus, but caring about how it gets done. Our state's procurement policies, contractual restrictions, legal restrictions, procedural patterns are really 1950s. It is very important to pay attention to how this gets done. 41 states have design build authorization for all their public agencies. We have to do the same thing in New York. So that's an example of the kind of change that can take place that can really make a difference. I couldn't leave that out. So we very much want to see New York City, the New York Metropolitan region and its governing bodies, and New York State work together on these. We'll be happy to join with you in those efforts, provide whatever information we can from the business community, but I think we need your leadership so that we can get a serious program to reform how we do business in making sure we have the package of financing and the tools required for the transportation agencies to have everything they need to modernize, expand, and move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, President Wylde. I'd like to ask council members if they have any questions for Kathryn. None? Members of the audience, any questions? Yes, sir.
To the partnership for New York question, is there any discussion at all of there possibly being created a regional transportation infrastructure bank? Is this something that we would come up in discussions aside from the parts that you said that should be implemented?
Well, unfortunately, as you know, as I mentioned, debt is already a serious problem, at least for the MTA, and would be for the Port Authority, too. I don't think more debt is the answer, and banks aren't in the business of giving away money. So the notion of an infrastructure bank is not what we would be recommending. We think we need an infrastructure development corporation, if you will. Most other cities or regions, countries have put together development entities that are able to attract equity and attract private financing. But in terms of a public bank, it's another way of saying more debt, I think.
I'm sorry, I just came to a question about the funding mechanism of some of these projects. We had met earlier, and I had discussed a TOD project that we're currently undertaking in Putnam County in the village of Brewster. And I've been conferencing with some of our union leadership. Obviously, their interest is to keep their membership working. And they have expressed to us the idea of using some of their capital to funding projects. Is that something that you have had any experience or discussion with in the 3 Ps?
Absolutely, yes, and that's something that was a big part of discussion on public-private partnerships and value capture. And there are institutions. I don't know if you remember Dennis Hughes, who was head of the state AFL-CIO, who is now working with a major infrastructure financial packaging firm. They're doing this stuff all over the world. New York institutions, banks and other institutions are doing these kind of projects all over the world using public pension funds, private pension funds, the construction industry funds. It's totally doable, but you have to have the rules in place, and most importantly, you have to have the flexibility in place so that you can undertake these projects without having the state legislature have to act on every one. You just can never get out of your own way. I mean, right now we can't even pass a design build for the city unless we limit it to one project. And you can't do what we have to do, more efficient, effective and cost-effective construction. You can't do it with the state legislature driving every decision and with everybody's political interest being resolved. It just won't work.
But you can do it if you do present legislation that can streamline the process. Executive Director Rivera and I were talking earlier about how projects like our TOD, and County Executive Curran's going to come up and take a look at what we've been able to accomplish. And in government, we understand that, you know, the initiatives and the programs are always there. It's public benefit. The changes in personnel, in leadership, in political influencing, in legislation, that's where you get the stop and start and stop and start, and sometimes the different focus changes. And before you know it, you've done absolutely nothing all too often. I would maybe ask if there would be something that we could package collectively to present to the state legislature and to the governor, of course, to say, look, these are the roadblocks. These are what are preventing us from making projects happen strictly because our hands are tied in certain circumstances that can be easily remedied and undone with just streamlining and cleaning legislation. And I absolutely would encourage that we embrace the union leadership and the stakeholders who do have a very powerful voice in lobbying for projects, obviously, as I mentioned, for the very simple reason that they want to keep their membership working and their families working.
I think that's a great idea. I think to the extent you could do that, put together that kind of package, it would be terrific. You're right, that's exactly what's needed, not a project-by-project attempt to negotiate this thing over multiple administrations, but rather a total reform and a streamlined process.
Right, I think that would be something that I would ask that the board maybe take on for this year and ask for your assistance. And each and every one of us have a representative that we can tap into.
And I think the governor, since the Tappan Zee, the governor has become fixated on this, really sold, and he really has this in mind. And so he's looking for your industry and your groups to come through with, here are the specific things we need as the generic tools that we can go forward and really move these projects, and wants to be supportive of that. And I think either through the form of the Fix NYC Commission, which doesn't have to be just NYC. In fact, some people in NYC don't even like that title. But I think in the context of what the governor is trying to achieve with the value capture and with this whole focus on infrastructure, what you're talking about is exactly what's needed.
And not to take any credit away from the governor, but we all know we're not reinventing the wheel here. This has been done in other capital cities around the world. It is being done in the United States. It has been done. This particular, our region, we have so many different dynamics and forces at play with environmental concerns and seeker and all of those processes that the volumes of legislation or the volumes of rules are really just daunting in themselves, and that could be, I think, something that it would take time, but looking at, you know, who's sitting up here and who's sitting out there, we could probably get something at least to a starting point.
I think that would be great.
Thank you.
Any other questions, members of the audience? Yes, sir, in the aisle.
I'd like to ask Ms. Wylde, you haven't mentioned the proposed Amtrak Hudson River rail tunnel, and I wanted to ask you, the Regional Plan Association has supported using the tunnel not only for passenger trains, but for freight trains, way to sharply reduce New York's overdependence on trucks. And this obviously makes for 24/7 utilization of the tunnels. And there's also some talk that instead of building 2 new tubes in the new tunnel, reduce to 1, at least for the time being. That would still allow the 2 old tubes to be taken out of service for repair one at a time and maintain current levels of service. And once all 3 tubes are operating, you could actually double rush hour capacity. You could use 2 tubes in one direction during peak.
Agree. I did mention the Gateway project as being a top priority because of the relationship between northern New Jersey and New York. We're one economy, and so I totally agree with that. I don't have any expertise on the details of the tunnel.
Just like it's important that budgeting for annual expenses have their own focus, and when you look at capital budgeting for the longer term and the provision of revenues for it, I think it's really critical that taxes be focused on where they should go. My concern really is, looking at the congestion pricing, which is in a way a tax. To me, it's actually quite rational because it discourages driving and provides revenues to hopefully encourage mass transit. But in the same vein, I think the partnership was one of the leading forces behind the removal of the hotel tax and the commuter tax about 15 years ago. And those are two of the most rational taxes I've ever heard of, because you have more cops, more firemen, more emergency responders because of commuters, because of visitors. And we probably lost more than $15 billion in tax revenue in that.
Yeah, I have to correct you on, certainly we supported the commuter tax. We were not involved in
the hotel tax?
The hotel tax. I think Rudy Giuliani would be upset if we took any credit for that, but we were for reducing the hotel tax at the time, yeah.
Well, I would encourage both NYMTC and the partnership to support the return of them, because they are rational and they could be quite helpful for the whole region.
Thank you. Can we limit it to one more question, please?
Yes, while the premise of congestion pricing sounds logical, it will reduce the number of cars in the city for that congestion. The data suggests otherwise. NYMTC, for instance, up down the study, shows continuation that the number of cars coming into the CBD, the area, has continued to go down. In fact, right now, it's at a level that has not been seen since 1982. Yet congestion is worse than ever. That would suggest that merely reducing the numbers of vehicles, which is the only thing that congestion tax does, is not going to effectively reduce congestion. With regard to that, a similar situation has occurred in London, as is in today's paper. Secondly, I do have the NYMTC report over here. Secondly, with regard to raising money for the subways or any transportation, the problem has to do with the following. Both the subways and the commuter rails essentially mean the fare recovery rate is only 60% of total expenses. If by congestion pricing, you move people away from the roads into the subways or the commuter rails, and one of the things that Move New York has said, they expect a $200 million increase to the subway, increased subway fares, because there's increased subway fares. They have not included the expense that really translates into a $130 million deficit in operating expenses due to the increase of revenue
Let me, because I know we're a time constraint, let me respond to your points. There are lots of factors for increased congestion. Number of cars is one of them. Circulation of cars, particularly of for-hire vehicles, is probably a bigger one. So there are lots of issues, and if you talk to my membership, they talk about bike lanes, et cetera, so we won't go there. Bike lanes and bus lanes that are taking up driving space. So there are lots of factors, but the point is that, in fact, going forward, we're going to have to figure out a way to manage traffic. And how we do that, through an effective pricing strategy, through using technology, we're doing nothing to speak of now. The red light bus cameras, virtually nothing. We have to start moving that direction. So I'm not recommending a particular prescription, but simply recommending that we move forward in that regard. Now, I want to respect the chair's timing.
Okay, we were going to limit it to that last question. We'll do two more. Quickly, please. Quick questions. Okay, just one more. Just one more. Okay.
Gateway Tunnel Finance, do you have any thoughts?
Well, we have to make a strong case to Washington that if New York and New Jersey borrow half the funding from the federal government, that counts as our money because it's our obligation. I think they know that. They're in finance, these people. So I think they're just waiting to announce their program so it can be the Trump Gateway Tunnel and not the Schumer Gateway Tunnel, right?
Okay. Again, President Wylde, thank you very much for your time and your remarks.